Hello everyone, and thank you very much for coming. Show of hands, how many of you have ever heard of macarons? Not to worry if you're unsure, take a look at this picture. Now, another show of hands, how many of you have ever eaten a macaron? Today, I will be discussing the process of how macarons are made. Now, if you're wondering, why does this matter to me? I'm glad you asked. If you have ever purchased macarons from a bakery or a grocery store, one thing you may have wondered is why they seem to be somewhat expensive. And there are two main reasons for this. One is the cost of the ingredients, and two is the technical level of skill required to make them. Understanding how they are made will help us to understand why they are at the price point that they are at. I myself have made macarons a couple of times, and so I understand the cost of the ingredients. Not only that, but I've also done extensive research in the process of how they are made, especially at a higher level, to better understand and communicate it. When it comes to making macarons, it's very important to have the correct equipment and ingredients that are prepared properly. To sift the almond flour mixture, make the meringue, combine them to make the batter, pipe the batter onto the sheets, let them rest, bake them, and assemble. Now this is a somewhat brief overview of the process to make it hopefully a little bit easier to understand. The first thing with any baked good recipe, having the right ingredients and equipment and making sure that they are prepared properly. The first step is to pre-measure everything. Macarons, like a lot of baked goods, are pretty involved, and you don't want to have to stop in the middle of a step to measure an ingredient. Secondly, the almond flour. Almond flour is one of the things that makes macarons a little bit different from some of the other baked goods. There are two important factors to remember. One is that it is of good quality, and that it is finely ground. Having the almond flour finely ground helps to where there is less lumps in the batter, which will give you a more consistent product. Next is the egg whites. Steve Dunn, who graduated at the top of his class from the Cordon Bleu in Paris, the top network of culinary schools, wrote an article on the Guide to Macarons in December of 2023, published by America's Test Kitchen. To paraphrase what he says about the egg whites, they should be pre-measured and beaten slightly to aid in accuracy. They should also be room temperature, as this helps to build a more stable meringue when being whipped. The next piece of equipment that you should hopefully have is a food scale. This helps with accuracy of ingredients and also consistency when new batches are made. Finally, as far as the equipment goes, you should also try and have a silicone mat like so. Now, not to worry if you don't have one and you're trying to make these at home, you can just use a piece of parchment paper and trace on the back of it, using a 1.5-inch cookie cutter. Now that we know about how the ingredients should be prepared and the equipment that we need, let's move on to the first step of how macarons are made, the almond flour mixture. You take the almond flour and powdered sugar and a pinch of salt and combine them via sifting into a large bowl and set them aside. Next is the egg whites. The egg whites are whipped until soft peaks form, like so. Fred Zipsy-Levin, a scientist turned pastry chef, says this in an article about the science behind macarons in November of 2022. The addition of ingredients such as cream of tartar will help make a more stable meringue that will help your macarons. Once the egg whites are whipped, next is to make the sugar syrup. Water and sugar are combined in a saucepan and heated until 245 degrees, after which the hot syrup is poured directly into the egg whites while being whipped. They are then whipped until just shy of stiff peas, like this. After that, now that the meringue is made, it is time to make the batter. Believe it or not, this is probably one of the hardest steps in the process, as it is very easy to both over and undermix the batter. Making the batter. Fun fact, this process is actually called macaronage. You take the almond flour mixture and pour it into the meringue mixture. Then, using a rubber spatula, you carefully stir or fold in the flour and incorporate it into the batter. This continues until the batter flows off of the spatula for roughly 8 to 10 seconds, and should settle or recombine with the rest of the batter within 30 seconds. Now, if you're thinking this sounds pretty involved and specific, that's because it is. This is one of the reasons that macarons are difficult and specific to make. Once the batter is made, it is time to pipe, let it rest, and let them bake. Using a piping bag, the batter is piped onto cookie sheets in the circle forms like the silicone mat we saw earlier, and then they are let rest for roughly 20 minutes to form a skin over the top of the macaron. This skin prevents air from escaping during baking, which causes cracks throughout the macaron cookie. Interesting thing about macarons. Hugh Tucker, a prominent travel journalist, wrote an article in May of 2022 about the true origin of macarons. That was published by the BBC. In his article, he talks about the Maison de Soeurs Macarons. These are different as they have cracks throughout the entirety of the cookie, and no filling whatsoever. These are some of the first macarons that were ever made, which is interesting as to where most macarons nowadays that you see everywhere have no cracks whatsoever. Once the shells are baked and cooled, the filling is usually made while the shells are cooling. Once the filling is made, it is on to the final step, assembly. The filling is piped onto one of the cookie sides and then sandwiched. This process is repeated until all the cookies are assembled, and then they are placed on a cookie sheet and wrapped well. They are then left to refrigerate for up to 24 hours and brought to room temperature before serving. Today, we have discussed the process of how macarons are made. It is important to have the right ingredients and equipment and that are prepared properly, to make the almond flour mixture and meringue, combine them to make the batter, pipe the batter onto a sheet and let it rest, bake the shells, and finally assemble them. I hope this speech has helped you understand the process and therefore price of macarons. I also hope that it has inspired you to maybe make something yourself in the future. I find it very rewarding personally, and I think it's a lot of fun. Thank you for listening.